Hi everyone. Finally getting to something written on the whiteboard, which is the university tag, a creation of Joe Spivey. He has a Booktube channel, which I'll list down below. It's a Sunday. I am done with things that I needed, or more importantly, wanted to do this morning, which is go to the climbing gym. Oh, I'm doing this again, just because it's actually turned out to be pretty easy. So I have my laptop here to remind me of a few books that I want to talk about. Number one, etymologically, the word university is derived from the Latin universitas, magistrorum, a scholarium, meaning a community of teachers and scholars. What was the last book you read by two or more writers in coordination? The book that came to mind immediately is one that I've mentioned before, and that is Valley of the Bird Tale, which is written by two Canadians. I have it up here on my laptop. Valley of the Bird Tale, An Indian Reserve, A White Town, and the Road to Reconciliation by Andrew Stobo Snyderman and Douglas Sanderson. They're both attorneys, and Sanderson is a Swampy Cree Beaver clan of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. So this is a story about the town of Rossburn and a Indian reserve called Wayway-See-Capo, which is across the river, or creek, but I think it's a river. They share the same valley. And what I loved about this book is that it gives some history of both groups of people. The town, the Indian Reserve, how the Indian Reserve came to be. It talks about Ukrainian settlers in the area and the way that the Canadian government forced Indigenous people into reserves, and specifically it's talking about this particular reserve, and the opinions of different governments in Canada, in the local government changing their minds about certain things, the stark difference between the people in Wayway-See-Capo and the people in Rossburn in terms of income levels, opportunities, futures. And what's really interesting about the book is that it zeroes in on a couple different families in both areas, and you follow through different generations. And it's really done with a light enough touch that it tells a good story and also brings in facts. Highly recommend. So I'm glad for the opportunity to talk about that book again. Number two, in 1088, the University of Bologna saw the advent of the university as we recognize it today. What is your favorite, most recently read novel set in Italy? I don't know what I would have answered this with. Well, I guess I would have answered a Natalia Ginsburg or The Forbidden Notebook, which is a book that came out in the last year or so. But I have another favorite, which is really recent, and that is Jhumpa Lahiri's Whereabouts. So Jhumpa Lahiri is new for me this year. I read The Interpreter of Maladies this year, my first Jhumpa Lahiri book, and then I read Whereabouts, and I absolutely adore that story. It's like a novella, and it creates such an atmosphere. I loved just traveling along everyday life with this woman who is broken up from someone after, I think, 5 years. But it's an internal journey, and it's also just the external everyday life of where she is in Italy. I don't know if it's Rome or not, I've forgotten, but yeah, highly recommend. Number three, university study usually involves a significant change of residence or lifestyle. What's your favorite book or series focusing on an immediate change of residence? thing that came to mind immediately was Jane Eyre, because I just read Jane Eyre, I think it was just this year for the first time, and I was struck by, first of all, I was struck by how the story starts. It's such a sad start. She's being abused and just in an awful way, very young age, and then she goes to, I'm not sure what happens between her there at that house with that family and becoming a governess, but I know she ends up at a house where she's a governess, and so she's somewhat displaced, but and then displaced again because she leaves and it just runs away from that house and ends up randomly at a stranger's house, but it turns out to be a really good thing, and on and on. So that's my favorite example of it. And then I also thought of Where Angels Fear to Tread by E.M. Forster, which I also read for the first time in the last 12 months, I would say. And that one, the widow, the young widow, leaves her home in the UK, in Great Britain, and goes to Italy on a whim and just needs to get away. And plot ensues from there when she meets this dashing, charming Italian guy. So I thought that was that's a really interesting book, bringing together the family, her in-laws back in England, and then to this town in Italy they eventually come. Okay. Number 4, the 21st century university student is expected to fork out tens of thousands in order to breach a university's sun-gilt facilities. Name a book that cost you an exorbitant amount in exchange for little reward. I was thinking about this. I don't spend a lot of money on books. I usually buy, if I'm buying a book at all, it's at a used bookstore or at a library sale, even better, or at the thrift store. So the only thing I could think of is about a year and a half ago, I stopped in the used bookstore that's near the library, the very branch that I go to every weekend in the city. And I don't know why I went in that bookstore. I guess I was curious about it. I mean, I could literally go into it often if I wanted to, but it's the one and only time I was in there, and I realized, I knew it was a used bookstore, and I realized that it had books that were more curated, not antiquarian, but certainly were going to be more expensive overall than what I'm used to paying for used books. And I picked up, for whatever reason, I picked up an Anthony Trollope. I'd never read Anthony Trollope. I didn't even know whether I'd ever read Anthony Trollope. But something about this hardback, which again, I don't ever buy unless I have to, intrigued me, and it was $10. It had a plastic cover on it, like someone had put on the cover. It's not a library book. And it's called Orley Farm, and I've never read it. The pages are paper thin, and the font is not dark and small. So, yeah, I have no idea what I was doing that day. Number 6, what is your favorite novel set within the walls of a university campus? Easy answer for me, it's going to be The Secret History by Donna Tartt. But I would say that it's The Secret History by Donna Tartt that I read when it was first published, so in 1993 or something. That experience of The Secret History is the best experience for me. I'll never forget it. I was reading something like I had never read before. So what is that, 30 years ago? But I tried rereading it and like 3 years ago, and it just doesn't read the same for me. I'm 30 years older, but still, I appreciate it for what it is and what it was when it was first published. So taken back into the time in which it was published, it was an extraordinary book. But lately, if I had to think of something since then, I would say University Campus. I would say this book came to my mind that I just read this year. It's a debut novel. It's called The Adult by Bronwyn Fisher. And I have to say, it was a standout for me. It's about a young woman who goes to college in Toronto, and she is very lonely. This is, I think I've just said by Bronwyn Fisher. And she's very lonely. She just happens to bump into a woman on a park bench named Nora, an older woman, older than her. And she's just intrigued by this woman. I think for some reason they exchange information. If I'm remembering correctly, Nora may be a professor. And they become closer. You don't know where it's going. You're just as interested in Nora as, I think her name's Natalie is. And the main character starts to expect or suspect that Nora's got some more of a past than she's saying. She's split up from her partner. She knows that much. And just the way that it unfolds and the twists and turns and the nuanced twists and turns, it's just a delight. All right. 7. Universities are touted as bastions of free thought and uninhibited expression. Name a book you've read that's produced by someone with whom you fundamentally disagree on the subject, but you like because of the eloquence with which it is written. I had to think a long time about this, but when the answer came to me, it was so obvious. And that is Ayn Rand. I discovered Ayn Rand when it was late 80s. I stumbled on either Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead. I don't remember which one I read first. It was this mass market paperback, so it was chunky. And I fell in love mainly with the way that Ayn Rand was writing her female character. And the same was true in the second book, whichever one I read first and second. I read both of those. I was blown away by how this woman in the, I don't know when this book was written, in the 40s or something, I'm guessing now, because I don't have it in front of me. But I was so intrigued by Ayn Rand. I was so impressed that she was impressing what I could tell was her philosophy, or at least her message, into her books about staunch, putting yourself forward, making your opinions known, and having goals and going after it. That's my, as I was so young at that point, I was, I don't know, in my early 20s. So I eventually read one of her biographies, whatever biography came out at that time. It was at the library, and I picked it up and I read the biography. So then I understood her philosophy, which is called objectivism. She was Russian-born, American writer. It seemed like this putting oneself forward, doing something for yourself before others, I guess. But it seemed like it was putting forward this idea of being strong-willed, having ideas and goals and going after them. But in the end, it seemed like those goals were doing good for society. So I didn't think that it was a negative thing, but it is egoistic. It's a form of egoism. But for a female, that felt like, for her female characters, that felt like a really positive thing. But as I read more and more about Ayn Rand and how she took this belief system to the extreme, then I realized, oh, okay, anything taken to the extreme turns out to probably not be a good idea for other people in your life or society. So, but it was a really fun journey. I later read a newer biography that came out like in 2015 or something, and it was just fun to go back and revisit someone who I had discovered in the 80s. Okay, universities pride themselves on cherishing outpourings from previously silenced or oppressed minorities. Name a favorite book written by someone from an underrepresented group. This is Richard Wagamese, and a book that I read just this year, Letters to My Son on the Ojibwe Path. I'm sorry I didn't look it up before I was making this video, but it's done in a memoir style, letters to his young son, who was 6 years old. He, at this time, was estranged from his wife, and he tells his young son everything that he wants his son to know about him, his journey in life, and how he was taken from his family and adopted by Ukrainian parents, I believe, but then how he reconnected with a family member to learn about his culture. He really wanted to learn more about the Ojibwe people and, more importantly, the philosophy and belief system and traditions. And this is just such a fantastic book. His writing is wonderful, but I learned a lot about Richard Wagamese, but also the way that he took what he learned from, I think it's an uncle, how he used that to change his own life and how he incorporated what he was learning from that family member to help him with some of the struggles he was having in his own life. University study can be riddled with dense, impenetrable scholarly tomes. What is your favorite piece of interpretive nonfiction written by an academic? I wasn't sure. Joe really had me Googling what this meant, interpretive nonfiction. I think it means a piece of nonfiction that is not necessarily, it's interpreted by the author in a way that perhaps you can feel the author's presence in the way the book is written. The author has a message that he wants to get across. I remembered a book I really enjoyed, a nonfiction book called Kiki Man Ray, and it's by Mark Bod. And I wondered if Mark Bod was an academic, and it does say that Mark Bod is a cultural historian. He's the author of 3 books. He's been a visiting fellow at the American Library in Paris, a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford, and so on and so on. So yeah, an academic for sure. But he wrote this book, Kiki Man Ray, about Kiki de Montparnasse, who was in Paris in the 1920s. And she's a nightclub performer, but she's also a budding artist. Hi everyone. I'm jumping in because the last 3 minutes of the video lost sound completely. It's gone. So I'm just going to finish my thoughts on Kiki Man Ray and close out this tag video. So the book is about Kiki's own pursuit of her art. This is what the author is trying to raise up in this book, is Kiki's own life aside from her being a muse of Man Ray, which she certainly was. And she took advantage of that relationship. These are the types of things that females at this time needed to do at times to raise their own boat and to be in the right circles and to get a show of her paintings and be seen as a creative person in her own right. So she did go on to be in some movies. I think they were movies that Man Ray made. In one of the movies, she was listed as Kiki Man Ray, which I suppose is why the book is titled that way. But I love this time in history, the displaced U.S. artists and creatives being in Paris, and then some of the Paris artists coming to the U.S. and the views of the U.S. and the type of art that this avant-garde group of people were making is a delight to read, for me anyway. It's fascinating in terms of what was thought to be almost like a Victorian type of attitude in the US to the avant-garde. There's another book that I read along the same lines in the same time period, which is a book on Marcel Duchamp, and it also came out like in 2022. So I'll list that in the notes. I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head. So I think that's question 9, and this has been really fun. Do this tag. If you have a Booktube channel, consider yourself tagged. It's so much fun. It really gets you thinking in different ways, in books that you've read in the past, books that you haven't thought of for a while, and in different book categories. So it's really fun. I am going to tag a few people, and then if I think of others that haven't yet done this tag, then I'll list them also below, but please consider yourself tagged. And I am going to tag Bob from Bob the Booker, and Ben from Ben Reads Good. I don't think either of you have done the tag, and my apologies if you have. Sophie from Biblio Sophie, and Gretchen from Made You Book. She has just done her first tag, which I think is called the end of the year tag, and it looks like she had a lot of fun with it. That video is a really fun one to watch. She talks about a lot of different book genres and what her plans are for the future. She isn't shy about taking on large projects, so that was really fun to watch. And Sarah at Hardcover Hearts. No pressure to do this tag or not to any one of the booktubers that I mentioned. Thanks for joining me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of the books that I've talked about here, books or authors. And please join in the conversation below. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.